Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, from me, Guy Monson, to our regular 6-minute strategy summary. Equity markets have been a little softer over the last 2 weeks, reflecting weaker data out of the US and UK, a surge in gas and power prices across much of Europe, and of course a regulatory tsunami from the government in Beijing, hitting what is already a slightly more fragile economic recovery over there. In addition, across the Pacific region, we've seen a rise in military tensions, missile tests in North and South Korea, and of course the possibility of an arms race in the aftermath of the announcement of the Australian, US and UK nuclear submarine deal. All of this reminds us of the long journey back to normality that investors are facing after the COVID crisis and all the financial and fiscal response that came with that. We'll be considering these issues, looking at the scarring of the world economy and seeing what this implies for policy. All of this is in a build-up to our own 3-day investment conference which we have at Saracen, which will set policy for the fourth quarter and which I'll report to you next week. Let's begin with a chart that we looked at in last time's session, showing the progress of the world economy since the eve of COVID, Q4 2019, where I've rebased GDP at 100. China 8% larger now than it was pre-COVID, an incredible achievement. The US about 1% larger. Euro area and UK rapidly catching up. For the latter, we expect UK GDP to exceed its pre-COVID level somewhere around December of this year. A far, far better outcome than we could ever have dreamed of 6 or 9 months ago. But those better than expected numbers are beginning to fade. And I've shown on the right the G10 Economic Surprises Index, which has turned sharply down, meaning that now economists are tending to be a little bit too optimistic. We've reacted to this softer data by pulling back our US GDP numbers for 2021 from a blistering hot 6.8% to a still highly respectable 5.5%. But the message is the world is slowing. So what's causing this? Well, renewed lockdowns in the face of Delta variants, particularly in Asia, are one of the reasons. And you can see in our familiar Global Stringency Index that lockdowns in China and Australia are tightening particularly, and the UK, having been among the tightest of the lockdowns, is now one of the loosest. Yes, there's some encouraging data overall from vaccination. I've showed there the number of UK patients per million in intensive care across the UK, and while that number is growing, it's hugely less than the 2 previous spikes. So this plus booster data does give us some confidence. The second factor that I'd like to look at is an unfortunate feedback loop from this crisis, which is sharply higher shipping, power and other costs as global supply chains begin to tighten. I've shown on the left-hand panel in blue the Baltic Shipping Index, which shows container costs rising from around 1,000 on the index pre-crisis to more than 4,000 today, a near quadrupling of shipping costs around the world. The latest pressure point, electricity prices. I've shown UK baseload electricity, which has risen nearly 3-fold as the crisis has unfurled. I could have shown gas prices, which have given a similar message. Adding to this particular shortages, we've all heard of the semiconductor shortage. I've showed here US motor vehicle production, and you can see that sharp spike downwards following the rally after the depths of the lockdown, which shows the impact of semiconductor shortage. GM, Toyota, Ford, all pausing production. The third impact, of course, is the late vaccination of much of the emerging world. Now this is beginning to improve a little bit. Green means more intense vaccination. You can see better numbers out of Latin America and some extraordinary numbers out of China, who vaccinated more than 1 billion people. But you can see the pressure on the emerging economies, particularly of Africa. This, combined with rising inflation costs, is forcing many economies to push up interest rates much earlier than they'd like to. Brazil, Hungary, Mexico, Russia, Turkey, all tightening. So how will central bankers react to this slightly softer economic outlook, and what does this mean for their giant pool of bonds that they've purchased on the left there under their QE programs? Well, both Chairman Jerome Powell of the Federal Reserve and Christine Lagarde of the ECB have been speaking over the last few weeks. In the case of the former, I think Powell was clear. The tests for inflation and employment have been met, so we can expect them to begin tapering. I think they'll announce this probably next week and begin the actual programme either in December or January of next year. That taper programme will probably take 6 to 9 months, bringing a conclusion of the programme somewhere around October. The ECB will be a little slower and a little more cautious. Well, they have indicated that they're moderately slowing their pace of purchases under their giant PEP programme. Christine Lagarde was very clear, using Mrs. Thatcher's parallel, the lady isn't tapering. So a difference here opening up between the two central banks. Remember, for the Federal Reserve, the beginning of tapering and the beginning of interest rate rises is very different. They're not connected. We expect the first US rate rise somewhere around Q1 of 2023. So what does this mean for financial markets? Well, we expect that there continues to be a steady but gradual rise in bond yields. You can see here on the left-hand side I plotted 30-year bond yields for the US, UK and Germany, and they're beginning to tick up. That on the right-hand panel will put a little bit more pressure on equity valuations. And although earnings are strong, we do expect markets to struggle a little bit more than they have in reflecting that pressure from higher bond yields. I'm not going to talk about the asset allocation of implications of that at this meeting, because we're meeting at Saracen for our regular quarterly investment review. It takes place over 3 days, and I'll come back to you in 2 weeks' time to tell you what that means in terms of change policy. But in the meanwhile, a slower world economy, the beginning of taper by the world's central banks, but still very supportive liquidity conditions that underlie markets. Thank you so much.